All right, welcome to Tech and HSR's second complimentary webinar. Today we're going to talk about the FDA's Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP, how that is and is not relevant to the IRB, and how IRBs can leverage this structured foresight in their AI HSR oversight responsibilities. A little bit of disclaimer. So this content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. If you have any questions, please consult either FDA directly or an attorney. All right, so before we can talk about how PCCPs affect our, meaning the IRB work, we need to understand what they actually are. So a PCCP, or that Predetermined Change Control Plan, is a regulatory pre-authorization that the FDA gives to a device manufacturer that allows a sponsor to prospectively define future changes to an AI or machine learning device without requiring them to submit a new application every single time they have a modification. Prior to AI, if you wanted to change anything about a medical device after it was cleared or approved by the FDA, then you'd have to go back to the FDA with a new submission. But today, AI tools can improve themselves through learning. That's some advanced technology. And so they might actually recalibrate their algorithms based on new data. They might refine their sensitivity thresholds or even optimize their performance metrics. So if manufacturers had to go to the FDA for approval every single time they had these technical updates, then innovation would grind to a halt. So the PCCP allows for some exceptions to that requirement. And it has basically three components that you're seeing here on the right-hand side. So the first component is a description of the modifications. And this is going to spell out the specific pre-specified changes that the manufacturer plans to make, what parameters might shift, and what improvements are they anticipating. And then the second, there's that modification protocol. So this is going to describe the verification, validation, and implementation methods the manufacturer will use to ensure that those changes are safe and effective. So kind of think of it as a quality control plan for managing that evolution. And then that third component is an impact assessment. So this is where the manufacturer analyzes the benefits and risks of implementing those changes and then describes how the study team is gonna mitigate any new risks that emerge. So all of this means that the PCCP is about how a product might change. It's not about whether a research activity remains ethically permissible. That's something that we do in our initial review. So, as an IRB, you might be thinking, well, this is totally out of our purview. This is after it's gone through the IRB, not during an active IRB study. And you're partially correct. The FDA does not authorize these plans during a clinical trial. Instead, they want the researchers to use the trial to figure out what that roadmap might look like. So during the study, you're basically still following standard rules for investigational devices. And so more often than not, the investigator is not thinking about PCCPs. They're just thinking about wrapping up the study as quickly as possible. And that means that it's only those that have already decided ahead of time that they want to market something that preparation for a PCCP happens. So those that planned ahead give the PCCP to the FDA after they've completed the study using the data that you as an IRB helped oversee to prove the AI is stable and reliable if it's going to continue changing or being adjusted after it's been cleared or approved. So that's pretty straightforward for PIs that are being instructed by an industry sponsor on what data needs to be collected. So most big companies already know this process. But for those PIs that are sponsor investigators or making their own homegrown tools, in other words, tools created by doctors or researchers at your own institution. So that's where the IRB should really start thinking about this framework. Many local researchers don't realize that the data that they collect today might actually be needed by the FDA to judge their AI's future updates and required continuous monitoring plan. So what ends up happening is that they have to backtrack and deal with all of that time, money, and effort later. And so that's unplanned expenses in time and money. And that's obviously not your problem as an IRB. The IRB's job isn't to approve an FDA's PCCP. Your job as the IRB is to recognize that if a study involves AI, then the researchers should be thinking about its future. So a good study doesn't just test if the AI works today. A good study gathers the evidence needed to keep it safe as it evolves tomorrow, which we know it will do. So, okay, now that we understand what a PCCP is, then we need to address three dangerous misunderstandings that I see all the time when institutional leadership tries to figure out how to handle AI research, and they can completely derail your oversight if you're not careful. So, the first misunderstanding is locked versus unlocked algorithms. You may not have been told this, or you may not have been told like if it's locked or unlocked, but it's not something that you should focus on, meaning that the IRB doesn't have to ask, or you could ask, but it's not the core focus of your review on whether an algorithm is locked or unlocked. So, whether an algorithm is locked or unlocked is actually a technical attribute that matters for FDA device classification and validation. It's more about how the product functions. So, right, it's important, but it's not the focus. The IRB doesn't regulate lockedness. What we want to focus on is regulating the risk to human subjects. And then the second misunderstanding is that there's confusion around the PCCP scope. So some people think that if the FDA has blessed a PCCP or issued one, then that gives the sponsor blanket permission to change research protocols however they want. And that's absolutely not true. A PCCP only applies if the intended use, that's a big word there, of the device remains constant. We're going to get into intended use later, but for now, just keep that in the back of your mind. So here's where it gets important for us as IRBs. A tool's intended use in the research context means that the tool was what it was designed to do, for whom, and in what setting. So if any of those things change, then you're looking at a protocol modification that requires full IRB review. The PCCP is irrelevant at that point because it's no longer within that scope. And then the third misunderstanding is probably the most dangerous. It's the idea that the FDA oversight replaces HRPP oversight. So just because the FDA has cleared something through a PCCP does not mean that the IRB can just step back and assume everything's fine from an ethics perspective or even from a protection, human subjects protection perspective. IRBs still have to factor in consent, HIPAA, target accruals, again, if that intended use changes, and more. So let's dig deeper into this locked versus unlocked issue because it has been tripping some people up. So locked algorithms, that describes a tool's function. It does not describe its risk to humans. These are still important terms, but they're completely separate considerations. So when you're reviewing a protocol, it's not so much important to ask, is the model parameter list fixed? In other words, locked. Rather, it's more important to ask and understand if the model's evolution could change the risk to the subject. So, to give context for why this matters, the FDA requires validation under 21 CFR 820 for changes to a device. That makes sense from a product safety standpoint. They need to know the modifications won't cause the device to malfunction or produce dangerous outputs. But we, the IRB, are operating under 45 CFR 46, and so our concerns are going to be just a little different in this area, right? We need to know whether changes to the tool could affect the validity of the original consent, whether subjects understand what they're agreeing to, whether the risk-benefit ratio remains the same, and acceptable. And that's going to get a little blurry when you're dealing with a forever human data subject. That's a term that we're going to get into separately in a different webinar. But the point of this slide is to clarify that FDA requirements, if applicable, are parallel to the IRB and not identical. So think about some real world scenarios. Uh, let's imagine a locked algorithm where we have the algorithm is being used to make diagnostic recommendations for a rare disease in children. And so that tool might pose significant risk, even though it never changes because the stakes are high and the populations are vulnerable. Now, if you imagine now an unlocked adaptive algorithm that's helping radiologists flag potential abnormalities for secondary review in adult screening programs, meaning that the clinician is always double checking and confirming based on actual records and not relying on the AI. So that tool is constantly learning and adjusting, but the risk to subjects might be lower because a human expert is always making that final call based on standard procedures. So really the devil's in the details, but it's important that the IRB has these details so that we can make informed decisions. Okay, so now we're gonna get to what I consider the anchor, the literal steering wheel for everything IRBs do in AI oversight. And this is the formula that I would encourage you to internalize, basically intended use, right? So what is it? Intended use equals what the tool is designed to do, for whom, and in what situation or environment. Now, that is for SBER studies as well as clinical and biomedical studies. But the intended use is going to play a critical role in deciding if the PCCP applies in IRB review as well. So imagine a researcher comes to you with a protocol modification stating, hey, the sponsor updated our algorithm under our PCCP. It's all covered by the FDA. We just need to notify you, the IRB. So your job as an IRB is to figure out which of the two outcomes applies. Outcome one is that the algorithm updates occurred within the PCCP boundaries and the clinical role of the tool remains the same. Maybe they just adjusted some internal weights to improve sensitivity, but the tool is still doing exactly what it did before. The radiologists still review the same kinds of images, the output still looks the same, and the decision-making processes have not changed. So in that case, the PCCP applies, and you might determine that this could be an administrative notification rather than a full protocol modification. So simple. But outcome two is different because here the algorithm updates happened, but the clinical role has changed. So maybe the tool was originally designed for screening, but now it's being used for diagnoses. So, or maybe even it was flagging potential issues for a human review, but now it's making more of an autonomous recommendation. Or perhaps maybe it was originally used for adult populations, but now it's including children. So these kinds of changes you are all familiar with. These are not administrative changes. They fall out of the PCCP's boundaries. So the PCCP becomes irrelevant because now you've got a fundamental shift in that intended use. So if you take anything away from this talk, it's that a change in intended use is always a protocol modification and might require full IRB review, regardless of what the FDA PCCP says. Well, essentially. So the FDA might be fine with it from a product safety perspective, but that does not give us permission to skip our ethical and regulatory oversight responsibilities and document all these things. So when you're reviewing these situations, break it down using this formula. Is the tool designed to do something different now? Is it being used on someone different or for a different condition? And is the end user different now? For example, it used to be a clinician-facing tool and now it's patient-facing. If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then that's going to be a protocol modification, your standard protocol modification review. Okay, So now I want to introduce you to what I call the AI HSR Three-Stage Framework. This is a strategic tool that helps us simplify the overall AI review. Uh, the institutions across the United States have already begun adapting this framework to meet their own needs. And if you want to learn more about this tool, I recommend you go to our website at www.techandhsr.com. But essentially, this framework was originally developed to simplify the AI regulatory review processes based on risk and product maturity. But what we found is that it also is very useful in providing clarity on when and how PCCPs actually matter for your work. The rationale for all of this, again, is covered under the three-stage framework publication, and that scope is out of this presentation. So again, if you want to learn more, go to the website. But for this presentation, the framework shows how AI tool development is broken down into three distinct stages, research stages, and one non-research stage, and where PCCP evaluations might fit within each stage. So stage one is development and training, and this is where the AI tool is being built from the ground up. So the algorithm is learning from training data, parameters are being established, and the model is taking shape. And at this stage, the IRB is only focused on preliminary intended use, right? In the FDA space, the FDA calls this device classification. So in other words, we're figuring out what regulatory category this tool is going to fall into. Now, once the device classification is made, and only then can the IRB ask, does this constitute human subjects research? So we're looking at whether the training data comes from humans and whether consent or HIP authorization is applicable, if it was provided or if waivers are needed, etc. So moving on. So stage two is validation and testing the algorithm or the tool. And this is where the tool is validated with data it's never seen before to confirm that it truly learned what it needs to in order to perform its intended use, or if it's just memorizing stuff on what it was taught in its early training. So still, there is no PCCP authorization from the FDA, but it is in this stage, stage two, where all of that PCCP documentation is actually developed. Okay, now stage three, deployment in real world scenarios under a research protocol. It's often called clinical trials or clinical investigations. So this is when IRBs may or may not see PCCPs issued by the FDA. If the sponsor worked with the FDA in developing a PCCP, you'll see it. If they didn't, you won't. If the tool was developed internally, or what I like to call homegrown, then unless your sponsor and investigator worked with the FDA to develop a PCCP, then that means you don't have one and you won't see one. It's only after the tool has been finalized and ready for real-world deployment that a PCCP is issued. And it's only through the FDA that this happens. So what happens is they look at the validation stage data, stage two, and determine what changes the tool developer can make without having to come back for new approvals. And so the IRB will then take the PCCP and during their normal review the PCCP documentation like you would any other FDA drug or medical device document to better understand what the tool is expected to do for whom and how it might evolve during the study. And that was the three-stage framework, right? So, but what happens after that? That's when the IRB essentially falls out of scope for stage four, which is deployment and post-market monitoring outside of a research context. So the tool has now moved out of the research and into clinical operations, and the FDA's focus here is on quality systems under the quality system regulation. And they're making sure ongoing changes maintain safety and effectiveness. So the IRB may become involved if post-marketing requires it. And so in these cases, the IRB will need to address the PCCP documents, but just like they would as described in stage three. The only critical difference is that the IRB will need to document exactly what is research and what is standard of care, and if those changes impact, again, that intended use. So the key insight here is that PCCP relevance changes depending on stages. So in stage one is pretty minimal, but researchers should consider making sure they collect and prepare for the documentation needed for a PCCP. so that if they do end up with potential opportunity to market the tool, then they don't have to go back and redo any experiments. And then in stage two, IRB involvement in PCCPs is fairly minimal, just ensuring that that documentation is planned and researchers are aware they need to capture this information, either for the sponsor or if they're the sponsor investigator for further stages. And then in stage three, the PCCP, if received by the FDA, is going to be important because that PCCP will dictate when a mod is needed. So understanding which stage you're in is going to tell you how to approach PCCP documentation and what questions to ask. And that wraps up part one of PCCPs and IRBs. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll go over how to operationalize the review of these and when they come across your desk. And as always, if you have any questions, please contact me at info@techandhsr.com. Thank you, and we will see you soon.